While a full history of the Holland-type submarines is obviously a subject for a longer form video, it's important to note how this family of submarines started the continuous service of underwater vessels in quite a few navies. John Philip Holland had been trying to get people to buy his submarines since the late 1870s, but with little success. After a series of disputes with Irish Republican-independence movements in the 1880s, Holland decided to market his efforts somewhat more widely via the Holland Torpedo Boat Company in the 1890s. At the same time, he worked to improve on his designs, and in 1899, the Holland Torpedo Boat Company became part of the Electric Boat Company. The next year, Holland submarines saw their first major sales success when the US Navy, which had been keeping an eye on the progress of his work, purchased the Holland-6, which entered service with the US Navy in late 1900 after some slight modifications and carrying the name Holland. She displaced just 64 tons on the surface and another 10 tons when submerged, and featured an electric motor and batteries for underwater propulsion, along with a petrol-driven engine for recharging and sailing about on the surface. She epitomised Holland's early design principles, with a hull shaped roughly like a rugby ball, or an American football for those of you on the other side of the Atlantic, a relatively minimal spinal superstructure, and a small access hatch that could kind of be a conning tower. And the torpedo armament was located entirely up front, in this case a single 18-inch torpedo tube with 2 reloads. This particular sub was also designed to carry a pair of dynamite guns, but one of those was removed before entering US service and the other was fairly little used thereafter. This was followed by the main family we're looking at. A prototype craft, Fulton, was constructed to form the basis of the Holland 7, or EB, standing for Electric Boat 7, design and its derivatives. In most ways, this resembled a scaled-up and slightly more capable version of Holland 6. Among the more notable features was the fact the craft was now large enough you could actually stand up inside it. This design was seen as quite successful. It now displaced a little over 100 tons on the surface. Its speed had increased compared to Holland 6 from 6 and 5 knots surfaced and submerged respectively to 8 and 7, with range on the surface coming in at around 250 nautical miles in ideal conditions, a 25% improvement, but submerged range remained at around 30 nautical miles, again depending on sea conditions. The first orders for these improved craft came from the US Navy and the Royal Navy. The US Navy ordered 7 as the Plunger class, although sometimes these are dubbed the Adder class after the first hull to enter service, and the British version, slightly modified, dubbed the Holland class, was 5 vessels strong. The two types were, unsurprisingly, rather similar, with the main obvious difference in photos being that the American versions had small fairings either end of the small conning tower, while the British used a simple angled plate that was cut with negative spaces. Both types carried a single 18-inch torpedo tube with a pair of reloads, although some diagrams for the US subs show an option with shorter-bodied torpedoes which allowed for the doubling of the reloads that they carried. A few years later, with the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War, the Fulton prototype was bought by Imperial Russia and used as the lead vessel of the 7-strong Somme, or Catfish class, this time armed with a 15-inch torpedo tube and carrying a machine gun aboard for surface actions. The Imperial Japanese Navy, not to be outdone, ordered 5 modified Holland or EB-7 types for themselves, and these had a slightly more substantial spinal ridge and conning tower, and reverted to the larger 18-inch torpedo tube, but with only a single reload. However, the war ended before either side could get their submarines into combat operations. In actual fact, the British subs were the ones that came closest to combat, as they were readied for possible engagement of the 2nd Pacific Squadron in the Channel following the Russians firing on the Dogger Bank fishing fleet, but of course that didn't come to anything either. The Dutch would also buy the design and built their own single example, the O1, and thus the Holland 7 family of designs would be the start of 5 different navies' submarine arms. Other navies, particularly the French, would develop and build their own submarine designs from the outset, with very different appearances to the somewhat tubby Holland types. Subsequent submarines, including some from Electric Boat, would use principles of the Holland design, but very rapidly the upper casing and conning tower would grow, so that even submarines laid down a couple of years later, such as the Swedish Hagen, although showing a Holland-like hull down underneath, were quite different in appearance up top. However, such was the rapid pace of submarine development that all 5 nations viewed these early craft as second line or entirely obsolete by the time World War I rolled around, and for most of the 20th century, none were considered to be preserved. They'd all been scrapped, used as targets, or lost in operations. But in the latter part of the 20th century, the wreck of HMS Holland I, which had sunk on its way to be scrapped, was discovered, recovered, and preserved, and can now be seen at the Royal Navy Submarine Museum in Gosport in the UK.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.